Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and you're listening to The Business of Content, a podcast about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. In this week's episode, we discuss a media company that's launched 81 local news sites and is continuing to expand. If you've been working in local news over the past decade, chances are that your job hasn't felt very secure. One study estimated that as many as 1,800 local newspapers have shut down since 2004, and those that have survived have faced steep budget cuts and layoffs. Hedge funds have been purchasing newspapers, saddling them with debt, and bleeding them dry, while the Facebook Google duopoly has diverted more and more local advertising toward their own services. Last year, Facebook launched a feature that would allow users to be shown more local news in their newsfeed, but it recently admitted that 1 in 3 US users lived in areas that didn't produce enough local news for Facebook to curate. But not all local news operations have struggled. A New Jersey-based media company called Tap Into has launched 81 local news sites and is still growing. While most of those sites are located in New Jersey, the company has recently branched out into Pennsylvania, South Carolina, and Florida. I recently interviewed Mike Shapiro, Tap Into's founder, and asked him about why his model seems to be working. We also discussed other failed local news projects and whether Facebook's efforts to boost local news are actually working. Let's jump right into it. Hey, Mike, thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, Simon.
So, you've actually been on the podcast before. You run a company called Tap Into. Before we get into new developments with the company, can you give us just a brief overview of what it is?
Sure, Simon. So, Tap Into is a network of more than 80 franchised online local news sites in New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, and Florida, with more than 8 million readers during the last year.
Uh-huh. And the interesting thing about it is that you use this franchise system. So rather than trying to have this strong corporate control like a lot of other kind of media conglomerates, you work with local people who actually live in these communities where you're launching these sites. They buy into it. Here, can you explain a little bit about how the franchise system works?
Sure, absolutely. So basically, we provide the infrastructure. So we provide the site hosting, tech support. We do all their billing, all their credit card processing of their advertisers. We train them. We provide continuing education, and they do the local news for their town and the ad sales to the local businesses in town. And through proprietary software that we've developed, the sites can share content with a click of a button, and they can also sell advertising into each other. So it makes basically our network of local news sites, one, a network, and but two, scalable both on the content side as well as on the advertising side.
Yeah, so like if a person sells advertising on their own Tap Into site, they get a large chunk of all the money that they make from that. But then they can also sell advertising on other Tap Into sites. Like let's say they have a national advertiser or just a regional national advertiser that's wants to advertise all across the state. They get a cut of whatever they sell on other people's sites. So it incentivizes all of them to kind of work together.
Yeah, that's correct. And it even goes down to the local businesses because most local businesses, yes, they want to reach the people in their town, but they also want to reach neighboring towns. So through our system, we're able to help those small businesses because really the small businesses are not only the pillars of our communities, but are really the pillars of Tap Into in terms of our marketing base and our advertising base.
And most of the monetization for the sites right now is through advertising.
Well, various forms of advertising. The chief among them is advertising coupled with content marketing. Second is sponsorship coupled with content marketing, and then third is email marketing. And we can also do social media marketing for businesses, and we also have a do-it-yourself feature, which we actually have a patent pending on, where businesses as well as others can submit content through the site, whether it's a classified or a real estate listing or a sale for the calendar, and they can choose the towns they'd like for it to be published in, pay per town, and those payments split out to the franchisees of those towns.
And when you say content marketing, you're kind of what a lot of people would consider native advertising, where they could submit an article or something to that effect that is like a piece of content rather than like a display ad or something like that.
Right. We have various forms of content marketing, from content that they submit to content that we do for them. So there's kind of a continuum of that. But the key in terms of that is, one, that not only are our readers seeing that content, but because our site has very good search engine optimization, it helps them organically with search engine optimization.
Hmm. And you've said in the past that like an ideal town or candidate for tap into to launch a franchise, I think, is a town that has at least 10,000 people, because that's the minimum number you need for to have a robust business sector that could support it from an advertising perspective. And then you usually like advise that at least two people are working on this tap into site, that like an ad salesperson and then a person who's responsible for the news side, right?
Well, we have a number of different models. In terms of the town size, right now we believe that a population of 10,000 and above can definitely support a tap into site, as long as there's enough businesses either in the town or within neighboring towns to be able to support it. People can combine towns into one site. So, like, for example, if towns share the same school system or share services, it makes sense to combine towns into one site, which is fine. And then in terms of in terms of the in terms of the other aspect of it, uh, yeah, it's a matter of two people can do it together part time. One person can do it together by themselves full time, so they can do both the content and the ad sales. We also have other models, for example, like a nonprofit model, where a nonprofit could do this in their town, and they could do either the content or the ad sales or both, and then partner with a member of the community to do the other aspect of the business. We have 6 hard copy newspapers now that have franchised from us to be their online site. We also have a university model, and we also have what we call an investor model, where someone could actually buy the franchise and then bring on someone to do the content, someone to do the ad sales. But in general, one person part time could do the content, one person part time could do the sales. Though I think for larger places, like, for example, a Fort Lauderdale in Florida with 180,000 people, and they probably have 30,000 businesses, you'd want a larger team, both to be able to report the news robustly, as well as to be able to have a larger sales team to reach all of those businesses.
Yeah, and that's just so like that's just the minimum. Like you have lots of tap into sites where not only do they have one or two full-time people, but then they have like freelancers and stuff like that.
Correct. And it ranges from people that where they have a content person who does it on a freelance basis, to all the way up to a full-time salaried reporter position. So the franchisee can decide that, and they can structure the business basically any way that they want, which provides them with flexibility. And the model is itself flexible, so that there's not a one size fits all for any given community, because every community is different. So our model accounts for that. So whether it is a economically distressed community, or a rural community, or a Tony suburb, there's a model that works for basically every community.
And you mentioned there's a nonprofit model and a university model. So like I remember the last time the nonprofit, one example was like a local YMCA launched a franchise and then hired out people to run the advertising and content, and this was another revenue stream for that YMCA. And then the university model, I remember that I forget which university, but like basically a a journalism professor was running it, and then each semester of students, they were the ones kind of responsible for, as part of their training as journalism students, was like actually collecting news and publishing to the local tap into news site.
Yeah, that's correct. And what's interesting is we're starting to get interest, people reaching out to us from, for example, chambers of commerce, downtown improvement districts on the business side, as well as on the content side, civic associations who are approaching us and saying, "Hey, could we franchise a site in our town?" And in the case of a civic association, "Hey, we have plenty of people in the association. We'll divide it up, and we'll cover the content, and we'll either hire a salesperson, or one of our members will be the salesperson." On the part of chambers and downtown improvement districts, where they could handle the business side, and then they bring on an independent journalist who does the content side. So there's a lot of potential models, ways for these models to work.
Okay, well, that's a good catch up from the last episode, and I encourage anyone listening to this to go and listen to that. I'll try to remember to include a link in the notes so you can easily find that episode. So when we spoke last year, Tap Into, it had a few dozen sites, mostly in the New Jersey area. Now you're up to 81. Where did all that expansion occur?
Well, we had quite a bit of an expansion in New Jersey, but we also launched our first sites in Pennsylvania, South Carolina, and Florida, which we're really excited about. And what we've been really been seeing is that with a lot of local newspapers that have either been acquired by regional or national publications, and then their newsrooms being gutted, or local news sites that are going out of business, there are more and more people that reach out to us about starting Tap Into in their town. Whereas we used to get two or three people reaching out to us a month. We're typically getting 3 to 5 people reaching out to us a week now, and sometimes more than that. So there's a real desire out there for local news, and there's the void in local news continues to grow, which provides a lot of opportunity for Tap Into and other local news sites to kind of fill that void and provide local news for their communities.
And how much of that expansion is still like organic? Like what I always thought was kind of brilliant about the Tap Into model is it would launch in uptown, but then there would be people in kind of adjacent towns that would keep on hitting into the Tap Into site in that town, and they would start building up a desire for that kind of thing, and then you would launch in that adjacent town. But like it wasn't like we're having to launch from scratch, since people were already kind of aware that Tap Into existed, since there was one so close by. So it was a lot easier for them to get up and running and profitable more quickly. Like, are you still seeing that kind of organic? Like if like when you launch new sites and Tap Into in like South Carolina or wherever, like is it kind of that organic spread where it goes from like town to town to town?
Well, in New Jersey, definitely. In the new states, we have one, for example, in Pennsylvania. We have one in South Carolina, one in Florida. And what's interesting is they've all launched in like the last 6 months. And while we don't yet have additional sites in those towns, we've gotten interest from people in those towns. For example, we have one in Charleston, South Carolina, and just this week, someone reached out for a Hilton Head, South Carolina. We have one in Parkland, Florida, and just in the last 3 weeks, we've had people reach out for Fort Lauderdale, Florida, Orlando, Florida, Ava Maria, Florida. And all of those, basically came from hearing about the Parkland site. Whether they become franchisees or not is another story, but that kind of theory is starting to work even in these states where we only have one site.
And do you think they're going to have a harder job since they have less of that synergistic thing where they can sell ads across Tap Into sites nearby, and they're kind of on their own? They're kind of islands on their own.
It is definitely harder in the beginning, and because but I think they have an advantage in that they're the first, and so they're kind of like the forefather of Tap Into in that state. And so the key for them is to do as good a job as possible, not only for themselves because it will help them grow their business, but it will also attract other people who are interested in starting Tap Into. And the more sites that start Tap Into near them, the more cross selling they'll have, and the more sharing of content they'll be able to do.
How is your job shifting as you expand? Because like as the person, you're the one who heads the parent company. You're kind of in charge of quality control. How are you scaling effectively?
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that I think has been a really big improvement here in the last 6 months is that I've been able to focus a lot more of my time kind of working on the business versus working in the business. So one of the things we've done is we did a transparency initiative that we announced last week, because one of the things that we've been seeing across the country is when there's a void in local news, oftentimes sites are popping up that are not objective, that are funded by political action committees, and or are generating fake news and things like that. And so we actually put out a whole transparency initiative pledging to our readers regarding our journalistic ethics and our standards and our transparency. And we announced a number of different initiatives in that. One of the things we're currently working on is also compliance within. So in addition to our transparency and our ethical standards, et cetera, we want to up the game among all our franchise sites in terms of the quality of the news content and things like that. So we're working on that internally. And then meanwhile, we've been doing a lot to implement new systems here to make us more scalable, more efficient, and provide even better customer service, not only to our franchisees, but to our advertisers and our readers. So for example, we recently developed an API where when a franchisee sells an ad to a business in their town, they can actually upload that ad to our CMS and it's placed automatically versus all kinds of emails that were generated back and forth. Statistics are now automatically generated, which go to the franchisee that they can communicate with their advertisers. They can search for their own reports, all kinds of things like that, and that we've been able to develop. One of the other things that we did was we used to use a service for creating what we call these dedicated email blasts that we send out to advertisers. We've now built that system internally. So now the franchisees have control over it. It used to be where while we did it for them, it could only go out on a certain day at a certain time, and they had all kinds of deadlines they had to reach in order to get it to us on time because it took so much time for us to do these for all the sites across the network. But now with this system that we developed, they control it. They can put them out whenever they want, and it's better for them, it's better for the advertiser, and it's better for us. So it's a win-win all the way around.
Well, one thing that you also do is you have editors who are working at the headquarters whose job it is like to help with quality control to where they can, email a franchise owner and be like, you should make, we found that these kinds of headlines work better. Or be like, I notice you haven't really been covering school sports. We know from our analytics data that covering high school sports is a huge draw for readers. Like you really should be putting more effort into that kind of guidance. Is that scaling effectively?
Well, yeah, we've kind of changed it a little bit. So Tim on our staff provides such feedback to our franchisees. But the other thing that we've been doing is we've been doing a lot more in terms of educational programs for the franchisees, because what we realized was, if we're providing feedback to an individual franchisee, one, you know, it's time consuming. Second, they might not actually get it that way. They might be able to learn it a different way. So one of the things that we've done is we're now bringing in a lot of outside speakers. For example, at our June franchisee meeting, Stephanie Murray, who is the director of the Center for Cooperative Media in the state of New Jersey, she's coming in and doing a whole half-day seminar on content, and in particular, how franchisees can better listen to the residents of their town and produce news that's of most interest to the residents of the town. We also brought on an outside consultant who has been doing seminars, live seminars for our franchisees on sales and how to more effectively sell. And he now does a monthly live webinar in addition with all of our franchisees where they can ask questions, and it's recorded. So if the franchisee can't be on the webinar, they can listen to it later. We've also now implemented biweekly franchisee calls where we give company updates, and we also provide continuing education on those calls, and those calls are also recorded. So if a franchisee can't be on the call, they can listen to it later. And under the franchise agreement, they're required to either be on the call or listen to the call later. So that way all of us are able to stay on the same page. And we've also been providing tips to them through two different things. One, our internal Facebook group that we have for all franchisees, and second, we redeveloped an intranet for all of our franchisees where we have training materials, tips, advice, all kinds of things like that. And all these different initiatives taken together have made us more scalable, and we've been able to provide even better service to the franchisees in a more efficient manner.
So, like, of the 81 that are running, how much are like on a very firm footing? Because I know that some, like, when one initially launches, you don't know whether it's going to be successful. How much are, have been going for at least 6 months and seem to be, if not profitable, like on steady enough footing to where they're going to be getting there?
I would say about 75 of the 81.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So so it's not like the 40 of the 81 launched within the last like month or something. Like it's still pretty organic and growing at a quick but not like a rapid expansion
Yeah,
pace.
and that's a really important point is that, I think that a lot of times the other companies that have tried to quote unquote scale local news, not necessarily through a franchise model, but just to try to scale local news, have scaled too quickly. They're looking for like hockey stick growth. And instead, to me, you really want to work out that model, make it as solid as possible, and grow slowly. And that's the best way to do this. And so we're not in a rush to get to 1,000 sites all over the country. We really want to build this incrementally and do it the right way. And 10 years into it, we're still learning. And so as we continue to learn, we continue to improve the model. And I'd much rather do that than see us be in 1,000 towns all over the country and then go, oh, geez, like there's a part of the model that's problematic, and now we got to try to fix it across 1,000 sites.
So things like they are going well for you, but they haven't been rosy for all of the local news industry. In fact, one of the most high profile local news companies, Spirited Media, has run into some trouble. Can you first talk about like what Spirited Media is?
Yeah, sure. So Spirited Media was an initiative largely by Jim Brady, who's kind of a godfather, so to speak, of local news. And he developed a site called Billy Penn in Philadelphia. And it was very successful. It was a hyper local site, and it was very successful. And then they launched a second site in Denver, and I think one in Pittsburgh. And it was really seen as a real promising model for hyper local news. But in the last basically 3-4 months, Jim had announced that it wasn't reaching the growth expectations on the financial side that they were hoping for, and they were in the process of selling them. And since then, they've sold, I think, two, or if not all three of them, to public, to public television or public radio stations who are now kind of carrying on the mantle.
Yeah, and I mean there are some definite key differences which we'll get into between you and between Spirited Media and Tap Into. One is that it seemed to be focusing on cities less, like whereas you can go down all the way down to a town with as few as 10,000 residents, right?
Right. I mean, we have tap into sites in some pretty large places like Newark, New Jersey, and Patterson, New Jersey, and New Brunswick and Camden. Um, but at the same time, Philadelphia is a monster-sized town. I think a tap into site could potentially work in a place like Philadelphia, but it would have to be structured differently. And I think it could work, but it would need to have basically a larger team, so to speak, of both reporters and salespeople, like we talked about for a potential site in Fort Lauderdale.
And so recent, like you said, it started selling off its sites. Spirited Media kind of tried to pivot away from advertising and towards memberships, and it seemed like it was having some success, but it just wasn't happening quickly enough. Why do you think they struggled?
Well, I think they struggled for a couple different reasons. I think one is that they had some of the traditional overhead that a traditional newspaper would have, like office space and things like that, and so that increased their expenses. And then I think secondarily was, some of the folks that got involved, capital wise, were interested in more kind of hockey stick growth. So while they were making profits, it wasn't enough for them, and that's a problem. And you couple those two things together, and that's why I believe that they weren't as successful as they could be, and that's why they had to in effect sell. In fact, I think Jim Brady said something like he can make more money consulting for sites than he can with these three sites that he built, and that's a problem.
It also seems like they were just too spread out. Like one thing that we talked about with Tap Into is that it kind of spreads more organically, where one town would launch a Tap Into site, then the next town over would launch one. So there was some synergy where you could have crossover readerships across locations, crossover advertising and stuff. But Spirited Media, like the Denver site, was going to be of no help to the Pittsburgh site. They were too far away from each other. So you couldn't like really have those kind of network effects that something that spread like yours could do.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, because they really didn't have they didn't really have a way of scaling this, and they couldn't share content amongst the sites in any way that would make some sense, and they couldn't really sell advertising into each other. So they could potentially, continue to launch these sites in different cities and things like that, but at the end of the day, they wouldn't have the advantages that, like for example, a Tap Into site has. And it was also really really expensive for them to do this in every community. Whereas under our franchise model, it's really affordable to franchise, and second, on the corporate side, it's very affordable for us to operate these sites and provide the assistance that we provide to all of them.
We also recently saw this report from Facebook and their efforts to boost local news. So, like a year ago, they launched this feature called Today In. And if you opted into this feature, it would figure out where you are. maybe, I don't know, I can't remember if you typed in where you lived or if it just figured out based on your IP address. But it would basically pull from local news sources and start trying to show you more local news stories in the news feed. I think something over 1 million people opted into this. But this year they admitted that a lot of their users lived in areas where there isn't much local news. So like I was wondering if maybe you could like were you surprised when you saw that report?
No, I mean I wasn't surprised because the void in local news continues to grow. I think it's something like 1,800 local newspapers and local news sites in the last couple of years have shut their doors, and so the problem is getting bigger. It's not getting smaller, and I actually just came out with a piece today in Medium about about saving democracy and the importance of local news to saving our democracy, and that's really what it comes down to. So I wasn't surprised by the lack of local news that's showing up in the Facebook local news project. And second was, I don't blame Facebook for it. A lot of people have been kind of bemoaning and saying, "Oh, it's Facebook's fault," etc. I don't see it that way. I think it's that these news organizations haven't evolved quickly enough, also in many respects they haven't thought outside the box. And then in addition, a lot of them have been taken over by these multinational conglomerates that have slashed these newsrooms. So when those different factors come into play, you have a lack of local news in your town. Just in New Jersey alone, the North Jersey Media Group was purchased by Gannett about 2 years ago, and Gannett made significant cuts to the point where, for example, one of the local papers, the Millburn Item, used to be chock full of Millburn news, including online. And now, when you open the Millburn Item, you're lucky if you get one or two stories a week about Millburn, and everything else is from not only towns far away in New Jersey, but from USA Today. And now, a hedge fund is looking to try to hostilely take over Gannett, and they have a reputation of even further chopping up the newsroom and getting rid of journalists. And this is happening all over the country, and that's why we see that there's this real lack of local news, and that void in local news continues to grow.
And also, like, I wrote a column about this a few weeks ago. Like, if you look at a lot of newspaper sites, like a lot of even thriving local print newspapers, their websites are still just terrible. So, like, Facebook, even if they're producing good news, like, Facebook can't really link to it because it's just not. They just haven't invested, and I mean it's not their fault. Like they're a local newspaper, they don't have a ton of like IT resources to invest in a great thing. Although they could, use something do something like WordPress or something that would so they could it wouldn't cost them that much. But like I was looking at two local newspapers that I used to write for when I first was starting out my career, and their websites even today, like Facebook wouldn't be able to link to them because they're just not very high quality.
Yeah, and that's a really big problem. One, tons of these local hard copy newspapers don't even have an online site, and those that do, a lot of times it's really subpar. And that's why, potentially them franchising with us, where obviously they keep their hard copy newspaper, they keep all that revenue, etc. But then they franchise with us for us to be their online site, just like the six newspapers have already done with us, is a really good model for them. For couple $100 a month, they have a really robust news site that Facebook can pick up, that they can utilize and grow their revenue, and it's really a win-win. And that could really be a solution for a lot of these hard copy local newspapers.
Yeah, and we're seeing like other solutions like that. Like Washington Post is basically making its ARC content management system available to everyone, so they can all have this kind of state of the art publishing software without having to hire the full team that the Washington Post has access to. And we see other people that are licensing their CMSs, kind of like what you guys are doing, where they take a small cut, but at the same time the newspaper then doesn't have to maintain and build their own websites from scratch.
Yeah, and I think the advantage that we have, I think, over those initiatives currently is, one, it's less expensive with us and more affordable. But second is that if they do this with us, they can take advantage of the content network and the advertising network that we're creating. In a lot of these other situations, they basically get a CMS in a box, and that's great because they can get online and they have a nice looking website, but it doesn't help them in terms of sharing content with other sites or selling advertising into each other. But it is certainly an option for them.
Did you see any evidence that Facebook was pulling tap-in into articles into its Today in aggregator, like its product?
Yeah, we actually see it quite a bit. We actually have a bug right now that we've reported to Facebook. Not a bug with Tap Into, but a bug on the Facebook side where they for Paterson, New Jersey, they keep pulling in Westfield, New Jersey news in Today In. So I reached out to them a couple of times over the last week or two, and they say they're working on it. But yes, we see them trying to utilize Tap Into news. So hopefully we can get that bug fixed on their end and get Paterson people Paterson news when they go to Today in Paterson.
And there's also a lot of discussion going on right now about news apps. Like Apple News has been sending a lot of traffic to publishers. Smart News, Flipboard are growing. Apple News just launched a subscription version called Apple News Plus, where you pay $10 a month and you get access to all this content. It's mostly magazine content, but they have a few newspapers in there. But none of these apps seem to be linking to local news. Like, why do you think that is? Do you think that goes back to what we were talking about with Facebook, where there's local news deserts, and also the websites aren't up to par? Like, what are you frustrated that some of these news apps don't really have local news?
Yeah, because I mean, study after study shows that that's what people care about the most. Is what's going on in their towns. But I think they're probably encountering the same issues Facebook is, which is there's either a dearth of local news or there's good, hard copy local newspapers that don't have a good online site or don't have an online site at all. And as a result, there's very little local news they can pull from.
Yeah, and you feel like if they could, like, you could see some opportunities there where they could use location data like GPS and says you're in this city, so we're going to try to pull news articles from this area. But it doesn't seem like that's really happening.
Right, right. And I know that with the Pew Research study that just came out a couple of weeks ago, what they were saying was the 81%, I think, of the people polled said that they really want to get their local news, but they're not getting it because they keep getting news from other towns nearby, but not their own town. And I think that goes to that whole regionalization of news, where these newspapers are coming in and they're acquiring these publications and then regionalizing the coverage, or the local newspaper is saying, hey, you know what, for me to compete, I need to regionalize. So now I'm going to cover 4 or 5 towns. And instead of putting out, a couple stories a day for your one town, they're putting out 1 or 2 stories a week for each town. And it's not meeting the needs of the people in those towns. And that's a major problem.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Mike, those were all the questions I had. Where can people find you online?
They can find Tap Into online at tapinto.net. They can find information about starting Tap Into at starttap.net. And they can find me online at Twitter at Michael Shapiro, and also on LinkedIn at Michael Shapiro. And I would love to hear from people.
Awesome. Well, this is a lot of fun. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Simon.
Okay, that's all we have for you today. Be sure to subscribe to the Business of Content on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. See you next week.